Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Religious Institute's webinar today on seminaries and Me Too. My name is Kentina Washington Leaphart, and I am the Director of Programs for Reproductive Justice and Sexuality Education here at the Religious Institute. And I am so excited and so grateful to be welcoming our guest presenter today, who's going to share with us some really valuable information about the environment and the climate in graduate theological education related to sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. And she is an expert because of her bivocational calling as both a civil rights attorney as well as a minister and someone who graduated from seminary and so traversed that context as both a student and as a professional. And so I'm really grateful to welcome today Reverend TiShaunda McPherson. We went to seminary together at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois, and met each other there as she was in the beginning stages of discerning what her call to ministry was going to look like. And I was really excited to see how life evolved for her there. And she has remained committed to being a bivocational person, both in her sort of 9-to-5 job as a civil rights attorney that has worked in educational spaces and has become very well acquainted with Title IX and what that looks like in educational spaces, as well as an ordained itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Currently, she is the Director of Equity and Access at Talum Global Education. And so she spends her time there making sure that students and employees have equal access to an equal treatment in their education and in their employment. So she's going to share with us a little bit today about what Me Too looks like in seminary spaces, what the law has to say about that, and how we can help to make our seminary, our graduate theological spaces, spaces of safety for all students and employees that are there. So thank you so much for joining us, TiShaunda.
Thank you for having me.
And just a couple of housekeeping items for the folks that are watching or listening via phone. We are going to be live tweeting, and so we ask that you also live tweet as well. The hashtag today is hashtag Seminaries2, TOO. So you can make sure to tweet any of the great information that you hear today. If you have any technical issues, you can enter your information, either the issue or the question or the comment in the chat box that you should see on your screen. We also will be collecting questions in that chat box as well that you have for TiShaunda. So at the end of her presentation, if you do have a question for her or a comment, we are going to engage as many of those as we can during the time we have allotted. So please just enter those into the chat box, and my colleague, our Director of Communications, is monitoring that. And so we will answer your questions at the end of her presentation. For now, I'm going to turn it over to TiShaunda, and she is going to present for the next maybe 35 or so minutes, plus or minus, and then we will open it up for questions and comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Kentina, and the Religious Institute for allowing me to come and share with you a little bit about such an important topic for me. As Kentina mentioned, it is almost full circle from having been a seminary graduate, a student and graduate, and now an ordained minister from my work as a senior attorney at the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, investigating complaints against institutions of higher education around sexual misconduct, to now being the Director of Equity and Access, overseeing our compliance of several colleges and universities. This topic, it runs in my blood, and it's very near and dear to me. And so I am grateful for the opportunity to share a little bit about what Title IX looks like in the seminary context, as well as what we can do as practitioners and theologians to ensure that we create safe spaces for our students and our colleagues, and what we can do to support those who have been victimized or experienced sexual violence or sexual harassment just in our midst in general. And so I am going to share my screen, I think. Okay. I hope you can see that. And so before we get started with, getting down into the nitty-gritty of Title IX and its application to theological education, I wanted to first start with some statistics that the Reliance organization put out earlier this year in February regarding instances of sexual harassment and sexual violence. As you can see from the statistics on the screen, over 75% of women and at least a third of men experience some type of verbal sexual harassment. Over 50% of women and almost 20% of men have experienced some type of unwanted sexual touching. About 40% of women and about 20% of men have experienced cyber sexual harassment. And then you see the statistics continue. About a third of women and about 12% of men have been physically followed in an encounter that has been an attempted attack of a sexual nature in some way. Close to a third of women and about 10% of men have unwanted flashing. And then about 25% and about of women and about 7% of men have survived sexual assault. So these statistics are very jarring, even in 2018, and it just really highlights the need for us to have this conversation and to continue to dialogue about ways that we can support survivors of sexual misconduct, sexual harassment, and sexual violence, and also create safe spaces in our seminaries, in our churches, and in our communities at large. So what is Title IX? Title IX is a federal statute that was implemented in 1972 to prevent sex discrimination in institutions of higher education. It's often considered to be the statute that allowed us to have equality in athletics between the sexes, but it goes beyond that and prohibits any form of sex discrimination, including sexual harassment and sexual violence. Sexual harassment is conduct of a sexual nature that is unwelcome and that is severe or pervasive enough to deny or limit a student's opportunity to access the educational program or to benefit from the services or the institution's school programs or activities. Now, determining whether conduct actually constitutes sexual harassment is a little bit tricky. And so kind of high level, I won't bore you with all of the legalese, but high level, when you're trying to consider whether conduct is sexual in nature, you have to consider a few things. One, is the conduct actually sexual? It could be sexual advances, it could be requests for sexual favors, it could be comments about an individual's body parts or appearances. It could be sexual attractiveness, sexual touching, even leering or gestures can be considered sexual in nature. Now, the second step that we need to consider then is if that conduct is in fact sexual in nature and if it is in fact unwelcome, is it severe or pervasive enough to constitute a violation of Title IX? And that is one of those very fact-specific situations that we consider. But keep in mind that a lot of people will think that, well, just because someone looked at a person in an inappropriate way or in a sexual manner, that couldn't rise to the level of sexual misconduct or sexual harassment under Title IX. But a single act of sexual harassment or sexual violence is enough to constitute a violation of Title IX, as long as an objective person would feel uncomfortable in that situation, as well as if under the circumstances of that particular interaction, the person felt uncomfortable in that situation. So the next thing that I want to consider is, how far does Title IX apply? What institutions does it actually apply to? And so the easy answer is all institutions that receive any type of federal assistance from the U.S. Department of Education, and that covers seminaries and divinity schools. A lot of times people have the misconception that Title IX does not cover private institutions of higher education or private schools in general, that it doesn't cover for profits, and that it only covers public institutions, but that's not correct. So Title IX does reach all institutions that receive any type of monies from the U.S. Department of Education. And the most common way that institutions are touched by the U.S. Department of Education is through Title IV funding. So if students are able to receive federal loans to support their educational endeavors at your particular institution, then Title IX will apply. Now, there are some religious exemptions. So for institutions that are part of a religious organization that have a conflict with the implementation or the application of Title IX, they could be considered exempt, but they have to submit a request to have portions of their policy or procedures be exempt from Title IX. That is not a huge list, and so for all intents and purposes, Title IX applies to the majority of seminaries and divinity schools. In addition, Title IX covers all students and all employees. So that's your female students, your male students, your gender nonconforming students. That's full-time students, part-time students, students who are taking a class here or there. That's students with disabilities and international students and students who are members of the LGBTQ community. Title IX covers all students, all employees, and doesn't exclude anyone. And that's important for us to know, especially in the theological context, theological education, because there are some institutions that have very restrictive or conservative perspectives about appropriate sexual interactions. And so assuming that those institutions are not exempt and haven't requested a waiver or been approved for exemption, Title IX still covers all students that might be on your campus. And that could be someone who's visiting, a student who, or a visitor of a student. It could be guests of coming onto campus for a lecture. It could be vendors or other third parties who are present on your campus for any reason. And your Title IX policies cover those individuals as well. It's also important to keep in mind that Title IX covers all employees too. So it covers your adjunct faculty, your full-time faculty, your guest lecturers, your small group members or leaders. And so it has a broad reach and isn't just exclusive to your full-time or your tenured faculty and your full-time students who are engaging in an academic program on campus. So what does Title IX actually require? So we have this statute that prohibits sex discrimination on campuses of higher education and in seminaries and divinity schools. But what does that really mean? So kind of in a nutshell, Title IX requires three different things. The first is that each institution has adopted a statement of non-discrimination that prohibits sex discrimination and prohibits sexual harassment and sexual violence. Now that seems simple enough, and most institutions will say, absolutely, we prohibit any form of discrimination against any member of our community, including based on sex, but you need to have that statement printed and widely distributed and to ensure that your campus community is aware of the non-discrimination statement. The second thing is that Title IX requires all institutions to designate at least one Title IX coordinator. Now, the person can have another title. It could be someone who's in your HR, it could be an administrator, but the person has to be designated as the Title IX coordinator, which means that that person is responsible for ensuring that your seminary or divinity school is complying with Title IX, overseeing any complaints of sexual harassment or sexual misconduct or sex discrimination of any nature, and facilitates all of the trainings and educational opportunities for students and staff to understand what their requirements and their obligations are under Title IX. The next thing with that is that in addition to designating a person as the Title IX coordinator, you also have to make sure that the individual is fully trained and knowledgeable of here's a role as the Title IX coordinator, and that your entire campus community has that person's contact information easily accessible. It should not be difficult to locate who the Title IX coordinator is or be able to contact that information or contact that individual. Now, the third piece is then to adopt a set of grievance procedures and policies, so that if someone wants to file a complaint with the institution, there's a set process for the student or the colleague to file that complaint, and to make sure that there's a standard process by which that complaint will be responded to and investigated. Now, sadly, in my preparation for this webinar, I did a quick search of probably about 20-25 seminaries and divinity schools. Now, probably a good 75% of them had a designation of a Title IX coordinator and something that would be akin to policies and procedures related to filing a complaint. But surprisingly, even in 2018, there were a good 25% that I couldn't find the information. I used all of my typical keyword searches, and I went to the typical spots on the website and couldn't access that information for a good portion of those seminaries. Now, granted, I didn't do an exhaustive search, but it's really important for those institutions to understand that you are bound by Title IX and could potentially receive a complaint from the U.S. Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights, for failing to comply with Title IX if you don't have that information widely published and easily accessible for anyone in your campus community. Okay. So moving on, once you have gone to the first round of requirements of Title IX, and you have designated a coordinator, you've implemented a non-discrimination statement, and you've implemented some policies and procedures. The next piece of your work will be then how do you respond to any complaint that might arise. And so that's why your grievance process and your policies and procedures related to filing a complaint have to be very clear and explicit for students to understand, but also for those members of the administration who will respond to the complaint to understand what their obligations are. And so some of those things include, making sure that all members of the campus community know where to file a complaint and how to file a complaint. If you have a policy that says you can only have file a written complaint, does that mean that the person needs to handwrite it or type it out and bring it to a certain location on campus? Does that mean that there is an online complaint form that can be submitted? Those things need to be spelled out and made and help make that information available to all of the members of your campus community. Your grievance procedure then also needs to spell out your typical timeframes in your investigation process. So if upon receipt of a complaint, someone on the campus is designated as an investigator and will gather information, including speaking with the complainant and any witnesses, that needs to be spelled out in your policy and your procedure as well. And then you need to spell out what your standard of review is, which is a legal term for basically figuring out how do you decide whether there's been a violation. Are you saying that if you believe the complainant at a level of 51% to 49%, that would be you're more likely than not that sexual harassment or sexual violence occurred, you would be using the preponderance of the evidence standard. So there are a variety of standards that can be used. Typically, best practice has been the preponderance standard, but I won't bore you with those details about what some of the other standards. You just have to make sure that you spell it out and that you use it consistently across the board. Now, once you receive a complaint, this is where things get a little tricky, and it's important for all of our seminaries and our divinity schools to really understand. Once any member of your campus community, any employee receives notice of a complaint or report of sexual harassment or sexual violence, the institution is then deemed to know that there's been a complaint. So that can be an instructor, that can be a small group leader, that could be the receptionist at the front desk of the seminary. It could be any member of your campus community. Once that person receives notice or should have known in the regular care of their employment responsibilities, the institution is deemed to have known that there has been an allegation of sexual harassment. Now, the tricky part here is that for most other colleges and universities, they designate individuals on their campus who will be deemed or identified as confidential resources or confidential employees. And those individuals typically are religious personnel or chaplains or a counselor or someone of that nature, so that a student can go and report the incident to those individuals, which would then not trigger a Title IX investigation. It's a little trickier for seminaries and divinity schools because there tends to be an assumption that everybody at the school would be or should be deemed a confidential employee or resource, but that's not the case. Just because of the nature of the institution or the type of education that's being provided to students doesn't automatically designate members of the faculty or staff as confidential resources for students to report. And so if you want to make sure that you carve out exemptions or exceptions for certain employees, you have to do that in your policy and make sure that everyone is aware that these individuals or these employees are designated as confidential resources. So if a student then comes and says, I reported to this particular faculty member, and you should have triggered a Title IX investigation, as long as you've made sure that you note that that individual is a confidential resource in your policy and your procedure and all of your Title IX materials, then a Title IX investigation is not necessary to be triggered. Now I know that's a little confusing, but hang with me and I'll try to explain it a little bit more as we go along in the presentation. But just keep in mind that for the majority of employees on your seminary campuses will be deemed responsible employees and will have an obligation to report any information regarding an allegation or report of sexual misconduct to the Title IX coordinator for investigation. Once the information is received and the Title IX investigator is notified, that individual or designee is responsible for initiating an immediate investigation. And so your investigation is essentially to determine what occurred and whether there's been a violation of the policy. You know, obviously when you start to investigate any sensitive matter, you have to be careful with your process and make sure that you're following your process strictly. But you also want to make sure that as you're responding to and gathering information, that you're taking all necessary steps to make sure that any potential sexual violence or sexual harassment doesn't recur and doesn't continue. Now, certainly that doesn't mean that you put yourself in danger or an employee has to intervene in a way that would be dangerous or inappropriate for that individual. But the institution is on notice and is obligated to do everything within reason, or that would be reasonably expected of an institution to ensure the safety of their students, their colleagues, and the campus community at large. And then during that process, offer any reasonable interim measures for the student who brought the complaint, as well as the respondent, if that person is a student or if that person is affiliated with the seminary or div school in any other way. And so some of those things look like instituting no contact orders between the parties. so that they don't have to interact. If there are 2 students in a class, to the best of your ability, either moving students into a different class or ensuring that the students are able to sit apart from each other, potentially making changes in residential assignments or work study assignments so that the students don't have to interact. And if there's an allegation from a student against a faculty member or another staff member, making sure that the student doesn't have to interact with that individual as well, to the best of your ability during the course of the investigation. It also looks like making sure that the parties understand their rights and options in the process, that they have access to any counseling that might be offered on campus, or any partnerships that the seminary or div school has with outside counselors, making sure that the students have access to appropriate medical care. These are all things that seem, kind of seem pretty obvious, but in the course of such a sensitive case or investigation, oftentimes are forgotten. And so these are things that should be spelled out in your policy so that you don't miss them, but also to make sure that students have the resources that they need during a very difficult time in their life. And then finally, after concluding the investigation, making a determination and making sure that the student and the respondent, whether that's a faculty member or another student, have written notice of what that determination is, and if there are any sanctions that are accompanying that determination. There's sometimes confusion about whether that information can be shared with the complainant if there's been a finding against the accused, or if there's been a sanction implemented against the accused, and there are concerns about whether that would be a FERPA violation. But it's not under Title IX. Complainants of sexual misconduct are entitled to know what the determination was, as well as what sanctions have been issued against the accused party. Okay. And so as we're talking, I want to make sure that in addition to understanding that Title IX has these requirements and obligations of institutions, that your obligations don't necessarily end there. And so as much as the information that I've provided to you thus far may be complicated or a bit overwhelming, there's more that needs to be considered. The Violence Against Women Act, the Campus Save Act, the Clery Act, and then other state-specific regulations oftentimes require additional measures beyond what Title IX requires. So the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, and the Campus Save Act in particular have expanded our responsibilities to students in our campus community beyond just your typical, or not your typical, but the sexual assault or rape. And it includes obligations for reports of domestic and dating violence, stalking, and other forms of sexual assault beyond just rape. And so you want to make sure that you understand those obligations as well, and that you report. Clery requires that you report any programs or training or educational programs that you have around those particular categories. And the Campus Save Act also extends our obligation with regard to reporting hate crimes. And so that's of particular import for violence or harassment of individuals from the LGBTQ community and other protected categories outside of sex or sexual orientation. I listed a couple of state-specific regulations that are notable for those who might be watching in Illinois and in New York. The 2 Illinois statutes expand Title IX obligations and require institutions to offer additional training to students and colleagues on a more regular basis. Also to offer the opportunity to report allegations of sexual misconduct anonymously. Title IX does not require that, but the Illinois Preventing Sexual Violence in Higher Education Act does require that students and members of the campus have the opportunity to report without identifying themselves. And then the Illinois Campus Security Enhancement Act also requires all institutions of higher education, including seminaries and div schools in Illinois, engage in a task force partnership with local law enforcement, with community organizations, and other members of your campus community, students and administrators, to help identify patterns and practices of sexual misconduct occurring on the campus, and to identify ways to prohibit those or prevent those instances from occurring. And so it's important for you to know, beyond just Title IX, if your state has any other statute relating to sexual misconduct on your campus or in your community, because you may have some additional obligations there that you wouldn't necessarily know of. New York's Enough is Enough Act is another one that has some additional requirements, and I know that there are several states right now in the process of implementing additional legislation around sexual assault and sexual violence on college campuses, which would include our div schools and our seminaries. Okay. So I talked a little bit about education and prevention, and so I'll just cover this briefly so I make sure that we do have some time to have questions and to talk a little bit about specific instances. But it's important to make sure that you are actively engaged in educational programs and preventative measures, and encouraging your members of your campus community, your students, your faculty and staff, your field site placements, any placements that students might go to make sure that they've been educated about appropriate interactions and the seminary's policy against and stance against sexual misconduct and sexual harassment and sexual violence against students and any member of the community. You want to implement these training programs not just for your students and your colleagues, but like I said, extend it out to anybody else who has a regular interface with your students. So that could be your small group leaders, that could be adjunct faculty. And you want to make sure that any training programs that you do offer not only explain the obligations of Title IX, but what the institution's policies and procedures say about sexual misconduct, spelling out the process for filing complaints, identifying the individuals who can support a student or a colleague in submitting a complaint, and then as well as describing what that process will look like and what the potential sanctions might be if a violation was found. Now, I know I've shared quite a bit of information in a very short period of time. I tried my best to shorten the presentation as best as I could. I typically do these presentations in at least an hour to 2 hours to dig in a little bit more in detail. But I wanted to give you kind of high level understanding of Title IX and where to really start. And so after having heard all of this information, some of you might be thinking, well, what do I do? You know, what's next? You know, what do I do with my particular institution? And a good place to start is to issue or implement a climate survey. And a climate survey is a really good tool for any of our seminaries or our div schools to get an understanding of where their students are and where their colleagues are, their faculty and staff, where their level of understanding of Title IX is, where their level of understanding of the institution's policies and procedures are, and what types of programs might be necessary to implement so that everyone gets up to speed and is on the same page in terms of preventing sexual violence and sexual harassment, as well as supporting survivors of that misconduct. Another good place to start would be to have focus groups. convening small groups of students and faculty and staff together to talk around these issues and any patterns or practices that they might have seen, in different ways they might hope to address the concerns that they're seeing on the campus. And then the last thing to consider is partnering with other seminaries or div schools in the area or other institutions of higher education. As Cantina mentioned, we went to Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, which sits on the campus of Northwestern. And so that would be a very easy partnership with Northwestern University and their Title IX office to see if there are ways that we can support each other, since students have access to each other's libraries and resources. And so consider those other partnerships with other institutions that are around your seminary or div school that can share resources and share information, share training programs for your students. And then finally, making sure that you access your outside community partners like the YWCA, any other religious institutions or organizations, your churches that are in your area to partner around this very important work, because it really does take all of us to create safe environments for our students and our colleagues. So these next two slides are just a couple resources to note for all of you who may be listening. There are several organizations that specialize in Title IX or sexual violence on college campuses. ATICSA is the primary one that most institutions engage. They offer trainings, they offer model policies, they offer intensive training for Title IX coordinators or administrators. And the same is true for the Association of Student Conduct Administrators. The other resources listed are the federal agencies, the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights and the U.S. Department of Justice. Both of them offer a wealth of resources on their websites, information about different policies and procedures that would be acceptable. And then for OCR, my former employer, I know that they offer in each of their regional offices annual conferences around certain topics related to Title IX and the other statutes that they enforce. And so those are good opportunities to attend free trainings and to engage with some of the experts who might unfortunately have to investigate allegations against an institution to understand better what you can do to support your campus community. They also are available for questions. So if you have a question or an issue arises at the seminary that you're not quite sure how to deal with, you can call them and ask that question without providing any detailed information about the seminary if you're concerned about getting yourselves in trouble, but can get a response to the particular matter at hand on a very quick basis. And then it's also important for us to know some resources for survivors of sexual harassment and sexual assault or sexual violence. And so we want to make sure that we encourage our students and our colleagues to know who the Title IX coordinator is and to make sure that person is welcoming and open so that reports can be received, to develop a partnership with the local law enforcement agency so that reports can be investigated. It is important to know, though, that your obligations under Title IX as a seminary or div school are not relieved if there is a pending criminal investigation by a local law enforcement agency. You're still obligated to completely or to complete your investigation under your policies and procedures, despite there being a separate proceeding going on in the criminal court. And then, as I mentioned before, the YWCA or RAIN, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center and the National Domestic Violence Hotline are some other resources to share with your campus community because there are likely survivors in the midst, whether they've experienced sexual harassment or misconduct during their time in seminary or whether they've come to the seminary having experienced those things. It's important for you to understand what resources are available so that you can share that information with them. So my last two, I know we're getting close to time, but I want to cover this very quickly. Some of you may be thinking, this is a whole lot of information, and what does this really have to do with seminary or theological education at all? And it has everything to do with our work in seminary and in our congregations. With the development of the Church Too movement last November, after the Me Too movement, we've seen an increased awareness of incidents of sexual violence and sexual harassment in our churches and in our seminaries and div schools. We've seen increased reporting because of that. And because of that, we are really obligated to have a communal response and to make sure that our seminaries and our churches and our communities are safe places for all individuals, including those who have survived the most heinous types of crimes and injustices against their bodies. And so it's important for us to recognize as religious leaders and theological educators and theologians that there are going to be and are likely already survivors in our midst, in our seminaries and in our churches. And so in order for us to best serve those who have been entrusted to our care, we've got to be sensitive to their needs and understand what trauma looks like and understand how to best serve and care for them. And that might not mean that you, engage in any particular counseling yourself, but being aware of the resources that are available in your community so that you can give appropriate referrals. It's critically important for us to really understand our obligations there in ways that we can truly support and help survivors go through their healing process and their survival process. I will give a trigger warning here because there may be individuals on the phone who've experienced sexual violence or sexual harassment. But I will share a quick story of a student who I was in a seminary with and came to me to report or share, not report, an experience that she had while we were in seminary. And it's something that is sadly all too common, and I've heard similar stories since graduating, and especially in my role now, where this friend of mine was targeted by another member of our seminary campus, and the perpetrator was someone who was respected in the seminary and was also pastoring a church. And he targeted her and started to comment on her appearance and what she would wear. He started to follow her into the library and try to find her when she was studying. He sent her very explicit and graphic text messages of a sexual nature, and at one point cornered her in a classroom and tried to tell her what he was going to do to her. Obviously, she was incredibly frightened, but she was also reluctant to report it because he was a valued member of the community and of the seminary as well as the local community. And so we have to be aware that these are types of situations that occur more frequently than we'd like to admit, and be prepared to respond to those situations when they arise so that we don't do more harm to victims of sexual injustices and don't re-victimize those individuals in a very traumatic experience or time in their life already. And the last thing that I want to mention just quickly is it's also important for us to engage in this conversation because it helps us to recognize that there are some biblical texts that are challenging for us and that have in some ways contributed to the theologies that reinforce violence against women and violence against members of the LGBT community. And when we recognize that these texts have in some ways perpetuated even rape culture, it's critically important for us to engage those texts and to have conversations around those texts and find ways that we can be more inclusive in our theology and inclusive in our communities, so that we don't victimize certain segments of our populations, and we don't disserve them by ignoring their needs and their their experiences. And so I won't go through them for the interest of time, but these are just a few that have really troubled me, and I've thought about and tried to engage in various ways in the work that I do professionally, but also in ministry as well. And so I hope that all of you who are on the call see the value in recognizing that it really does take a village. It's a community effort to respond to sexual misconduct and sexual violence in our seminaries and in our religious spaces, and that we all need to work together to make sure that we are creating safe spaces for all of those who have been entrusted to our care and all of those whom we claim to love and to care for. And so with that, I will end the presentation and open up for questions if anyone has any.
Great. I'm going to try to get myself not frozen here. Okay, there we go. That was so great. Thank you so much, TiShaunda. I was over here writing notes feverishly, and we have a lot of questions. And so I want to get to those questions first that the folks that are watching or are on the phone have, and then I'll loop back with a few of my questions. But thank you so much. I think this is so timely, and there was so much information that I had no idea about related to Title IX. And so this was really, really wonderful. Thank you so much. Let me go to the questions quickly here. Someone is asking if we're going to make the slides available. We will try to make the material available. And so all of you who have registered will get an email with the recording of the webinar, as well as we'll talk to TiShaunda about what pieces of her presentation that she can make available. This is her intellectual property, so we just want to make sure that we do that in a way that honors her work there. So we'll be in touch about that. You answered a little bit of this question earlier when you talked about the relationship between Garrett and Northwestern related to resources, but someone did ask if may a standalone seminary partner with a neighboring institution, a college or university, for Title IX compliance? Specifically, may a seminary contract with the Title IX coordinator of a neighboring institution to serve also as the Title IX coordinator for the seminary? So does the Title IX coordinator have to be someone that works for the seminary, or can it be someone else or someone contracted specifically for that?
Sure, that's a great question. And that's something that comes up, a question that's commonly asked in these presentations, because a lot of small institutions like seminaries don't have a lot of resources or a lot of staff to draw on. And so it is certainly appropriate and acceptable to partner with a local institution or another resource agency to designate a Title IX coordinator, as long as that relationship is memorialized in a memorandum of understanding or some contractual agreement that specifies what the individual's responsibilities are and how they will service your seminary.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. Does the process look differently when a student harasses or assaults a faculty member?
So it can, but I think best practice is that the process mirrors a student against student allegation. And so I say that because keep in mind there are a few different types of complaints that might come about. So there may be an allegation of student against student misconduct. There may be faculty or staff against student. There may be student against faculty and staff. And there may be a student or faculty and staff against a third party who is either unaffiliated with the institution or could be loosely affiliated with the institution. What I've seen in my work and in the institutions that I've worked with is that best practice is that those processes mirror each other. And so whether it's an allegation of a student harassing or violating another student, or whether it's a student engaging in inappropriateness with a faculty member, those policies and procedures should be the same. It makes it easy for everyone to understand what to expect. But if you decide, and you can decide to have different policies and processes, if you do, you just have to be very explicit in your student code of conduct and in your employee manual when each policy will be triggered.
Okay. This is another question, and I thought this was a really interesting one. Someone asked, at what point does pervasive sexualized disdain for clergy women constitute sexual harassment? And so I had to read the question a couple of times, and I think I know kind of where the person is going with that. And so maybe you can talk about, I know that the definition of sexual harassment and how that kind of gets worked out in conversations and allegations can be complicated, as you've already let us know. But yeah, pervasive sexualized disdain for clergy women, how that might constitute or not sexual harassment.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we are seeing more and more allegations of systemic discrimination or disdain, to use the individual's words, come about in terms of reports of Title IX violations. And so the complicated part of that is that you certainly can file a complaint, but oftentimes it's hard to prove. It's almost like in years past when there were allegations of race discrimination or systemic racism on college campuses, and you could see it, you could feel it, but it's hard to prove. And so what a lot of complainants and victims' rights advocates are doing are starting to create lists of specific instances that they can put together and show kind of a comprehensive timeline of the behaviors that are being targeted against women and in clergy women in particular. And that helps to really prove the allegation that this is not a safe space for women. And there are a lot of creative ways about doing that. It could be either in, so if we're talking about in a seminary, for example, female faculty members, their pay, their access to certain courses, the ability to teach certain higher level courses. In our churches, pay again, access to certain leadership responsibilities or roles. Those are things that are being researched and are evidence being gathered to support the notion that there's certainly a sex discrimination occurring in our seminaries and in our churches.
Wow, thank you. That's really great information to have. We have another question here too, and actually a story. And I was grateful for you to sharing the story, and I was heartbroken to think about someone that we probably both know. Certainly, that was the student, a classmate of ours, had experienced what they experienced at Garrett. This person says, my daughter was violently sexually assaulted on a college campus by a star athlete who was recruited by the university. Consequently, she dropped out of school. Now the university has hired a law firm to verify my daughter's Title IX claim to be reimbursed for her tuition. Doesn't it seem that the law firm is already biased if the university has hired them?
Yeah, it could be. But I think, so it's a catch-22. So when I was at OCR, I saw, unfortunately, a lot of similar situations. And what we recommended as a department was that the institution engage an outside investigator to complete the Title IX investigation, because we didn't think that the institution could remain objective themselves. Now, in our practice, we didn't think that that burden should be on the complainant or the student or their family to hire or to pay for independent review. And so there might be appearance that this law firm who is investigating would be biased towards the institution. But it could be that the institution has genuinely hired an independent agency. As long as that law firm is not tied up with the institution's general counsel office, and it's not a law firm that they hired to represent the institution in other matters. I think it might be okay or fair to say that the law firm could be an independent review. Mm-hmm. The better way to handle those situations, though, when institutions do hire an outside investigator, would be to work with the family who's brought the complaint to identify who that investigator or that law firm would be, and then the school still pays for it.
Mm-hmm. In our final couple moments here, you had brought up in the last couple slides that there has been, because of the Me Too movement and the visibility of the Me Too movement, an increase in reporting across the board related to Title IX or potential Title IX violations in higher education. Are the numbers, are you able to, I don't know if they're necessarily divided out between sort of graduate theological institutions and just graduate school as a whole. But I know that you and I have talked before about how the numbers are low, you know, in general, related to the actual number of sexual assaults and sexual violence that happens, certainly on undergraduate and undergraduate institutions. And we see that even lower across the board on graduate level. When you were working at OCR, were you looking at those numbers differentiated between undergrad and graduate institutions? And was there ever talk about kind of how the religious based education was looking, you know, even within that?
Yeah. And so the short answer is yes, we did look at, we differentiated between undergraduate and graduate education. And then some of the institutions that we were working with or had complaints filed against were religious-based institutions or private schools with a religious affiliation. And so we worked closely with them to try to understand better why these incidents are occurring and how we could better partner with them to support you know, their religious principles, but at the same time provide better service and access to students. And so that work is beginning, and I think there are a lot of institutions that are really committed to doing the work now, especially in the Midwest. I can't name particular institutions, but you would know them because they've been very vocal about their work on their campuses to eradicate sexual harassment or a culture of sexual harassment and sexual violence. The kind of generally the numbers that we were seeing were lower in graduate programs, mainly because institutions were not doing a good job of educating their students about the resources available to them and how to report. There's a lot of attention on undergraduate institutions, understandably so. But when you get to graduate education, especially graduate theological education, the attention is on just getting through your program. And there's an assumption that where you're an adult, so you should know how to figure out what resources are available to you. And that's work that I think is important to do across the board in graduate programs because there is a real need to support students. One of my most heart-wrenching cases that I worked on at OCR was related to an allegation of rape in a professional school. And the school gratefully worked very hard to correct their missteps. But one of the things they had failed to do was to educate members of their graduate program, and it was a religious-based institution.
Okay, 2 quick questions, if you'll give us 5 more minutes, because these are really good questions, and I want to make sure we get them in. They just came in. There's one here, and I had actually been thinking about this as you were doing your presentation as someone who completed CPE as an intern and as a resident. Someone asked, how do you apply reasonable person standards to identifying sexual harassments in contexts like CPE that have weird boundaries? Is it ever okay for CPE supervisors to make unwelcome comments about their sexual attraction to students or to make unwelcome comments about a student's sexuality? And I was thinking about this when you were talking because of the accreditation situation with CPE programs. And so I was wondering if Title IX applied in the same way, even though those programs are housed in hospitals or other institutions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So even though those programs are housed or performed outside of the institution of higher education, they are still bound by Title IX through the original educational institution. And so what I mean by that is if there is inappropriate interactions with a CPE advisor, if there are allegations of sexual harassment and the student reports that to their seminary, the seminary has an obligation to investigate that the same way that they would investigate it if it was a student complaint against a faculty member or another student. And during the investigation, obviously, they may be limited in terms of what information may be provided back to them because they don't technically have jurisdiction over that hospital or that staff, the staff at the hospital, for example. But they have the ability to limit the relationship with that partnership. And so if they have information of an allegation of some type of sexual misconduct occurring, they're obligated to do the best that they can to investigate, and if nothing else, to limit the relationship between those partners.
Mm-hmm. And the last question comes from an adjudicatory rep for a denomination. The times I'm a adjudicatory rep, the times I've had to deal with this in my role are in student complaints about suits brought against them. In these cases, both times, these were LGBTQ students who had complaints against them for being LGBTQ, just being queer. The seminaries in these cases, and these are two different seminaries, the person writes, seemed to me to be so embarrassed and unprepared to deal with complaints that they panicked. The student contacted me, which was a risk for them because I'm the person who will oversee their final ecclesiastical process, their ordination process. They did so because they felt that they had no LGBTQ knowledgeable or friendly advocate at their school. Mm-hmm. How are seminaries actually being prepared to deal with LGBTQ issues related to what we've been talking about today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll kick that one back to you, Katina, for the work that you're doing with Religious Institute and other members of our, religious circles that are doing this important work. I know that it's being done, and I know it's being done slowly. Sure. They're obviously very, hard questions to answer, but I'll kick that one back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you talked about in Title IX earlier in your initial part of your presentation, where you included that LGBTQ students are protected under Title IX, I think that's a really important thing to bring up, because I think that sometimes people who may have very limited knowledge of what Title IX applies to may think that it's just about a woman or woman-identified person being harassed by a male or male-identified person in their context, and not thinking about kind of all of the nuances and intersections related to that. A big part of what you talked about today is really organizations, institutions having policies in place, like having somebody that, like you said, you looked on these websites and you couldn't find for a good number of the folks that you researched any information about what their policies are and about who the person is on campus that people can go to. And I think that that's across the board. When we survey our institutions, ATS accredited institutions, about their policies, we do include what written policies do you have in place related to the climate for LGBTQ students? Mm-hmm. What policies do you have in place related to harassment? Because that part is important. It's great to have language in place related to sort of, the typical kind of, or ways that we sort of think about the male-female or man-woman dynamic. But if we're not talking about how this impacts people across kind of gender identity and sexual identity spectrums, we're leaving out a whole population of people who are present and who are traumatized and hurting at institutions. And so I think that we do continue to do that work, both through the surveys that we're doing with institutions, as well as offering guidelines and tips about how they can make sure that they're putting specific language in practice at their institutions, how students are learning in the classroom about gender and sexual identity, diversity. That's very important too. You and I both know that from our own experience where we were. And no institution is perfect. Even the most progressive ones, as we've seen, we both went to one that could be deemed, fairly progressive. And we obviously know that there were some things there, just as you talked about the student that was experiencing what they were experiencing there. There's lots of work to be done. So we continue to try to do that work. But thank you so much for agreeing to do this today. There was so much great information here. I know that folks are going to want to go back and reference many of the resources that you offered today, the biblical texts that you offered at the end of the presentation, which I think are really important to think about how theology informs so much about how we do or don't respond to sexual violence and sexual abuse in our religious spaces. And so that will be an ongoing conversation for us. But I think that having that alongside a really comprehensive and condensed, but you did a great job in a very short amount of time, because I know this is a way longer presentation usually. I learned so much today about, what I knew and was available to me and what I really didn't, even as an undergrad, much less as a graduate student. So I can imagine that students are, they don't know who they can go to. And so I think that this will not only empower administrators, but I think even the students that we're watching today to say, if my institution is not complying with this, or I'm not sure, here's what I can do to try to make them accountable, because they need to be. So thank you for your work, and thank you for continuing to follow your call and do the wonderful work that you're doing in both of your vocations. We really appreciate you.
Yeah. Thank you, absolutely, and thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you everyone for watching today. You will receive an email with more information about how to watch the recording. So if you would like to go back and watch the recording today to get more information, and we'll also make information available related to the slides from the presentation today. Thank you so much and have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.